Okay, there it is. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Local Solutions Convening. I'm Abby Abrash-Walton. I'm faculty at Antioch University, and I have the pleasure of directing our Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience, and the team at the center has done a load of work to make this evening possible and also tomorrow's day-long convening. This year, as I think all of you know, the focus of our conversation is on climate migration, specifically into the Northeast. And thinking about long histories of migration into this part of the world, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. And this is an invitation to all of you, to the extent that you would like to join me silently in thinking about what I'm going to be talking about in this acknowledgement, but I would like you to please join me in paying respect to the traditional owners of country throughout North America and their continuing connection to land, culture, and community, and to recognize those territories that are unceded. We are gathered together here in the Monadnock region, which has been home for some 12,000 years to the Elnabak, or people, of this area who have stewarded Indakina, what this area is called, throughout the generations. And the arrival of European colonists and their descendants in this region displaced and marginalized the Abenaki, the Pennacook, and the Wabanaki Confederacy peoples, separating them from the lands and the waterways, including their traditional alewife and salmon fisheries and their burial sites. The new and evolving colonial paradigm of development, now in its 4th century in this place, has given rise to this city of Keene and its surrounding towns and villages, to places of formal academic teaching and learning, including Antioch University, to manufacturing and commerce, and a vibrant arts economy, including cultural institutions like this one, the Colonial Theater. And I've been thinking a lot about the name of this theater and thinking maybe it's about time to start a conversation about renaming places like this, which are beloved in this community, and yet still these names carry implications and reminders. And through all of the years, the Elnabak have remained not always visible, but always here, and still caring for this place. So please join me with gratitude in paying respect to the Abenaki, the Pennacook, and the Wabanaki Confederacy peoples, past and present, on whose traditional unceded ancestral lands we gather this evening. And let us look for ways to move forward with healing and reconciliation, creation of safe, generative spaces of welcoming, of belonging, and befriending that evolve relationships and restore the natural world through multiple ways of knowing. So thank you for taking time to get us started with that this evening. I want to say a little bit about our sponsors for this event. We have some important people we want to thank, and our first major sponsor is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, which funded the Northeast Safe and Thriving for All research project this year through a climate adaptation partnerships grant. Researchers from Antioch, from Cornell, Dartmouth, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, the University of New Hampshire, and the University of Southern Maine are participating in this research initiative. Our other major sponsor is the City of Keene itself, and we are grateful for the opportunity to share our city with you during this convening. Keene was early to get on the climate change adaptation bandwagon with a 2003 climate action plan and a 2007 first in the nation climate adaptation plan. And since that time, there's been really important progress made towards achieving those goals. We'll hear more about that tomorrow. But for those, anybody go on the walking tour this afternoon? Great. So we hope that you enjoyed that tour with Ben Prost and Ken Thibault, showcasing housing issues, opportunities in a missing middle neighborhood that's been adjacent to downtown Keene. Another sponsor is EcoAdapt. They've been a longtime partner of ours since we held our first of these 5 now biennial local solutions convenings back in 2014. And we appreciate being part of the national U.S. climate resilience ecosystem with them and participating at their national adaptation forums. Revision Energy is a regional leader in clean energy, supplying residential and commercial solar in the Northeast. They are an employee-owned and B Corp certified company and have been named top solar installer in New Hampshire. And we also want to thank the Savings Bank of Walpole for their support of this year's convening here in our hometown of Keene. This premier local bank has served the Monadnock region for 150 years, and we welcome them as part of the climate resilience conversation. And lastly, we extend appreciation to another longtime collaborator and to members of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Any ASAP members here? Yes, great. Welcome. Good to see you. All right, so it is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage Melissa Hoffer, who is Massachusetts' first ever climate chief. Governor Maura Healey appointed Hoffer to this newly created role in January of this year, and in her role as climate chief, which I think is one of the very coolest titles a person could have, Hoffer leads a newly created Office of Climate Innovation and Resilience. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Chief Hoffer is responsible for, because when I read the executive order creating her position and the office which she's leading, I was blown away by the detail, by the depth, by the comprehensiveness, by the very proactive, very time-sensitive framework that has been laid out for the work that Chief Hoffer is leading. And so I want to tell you a little bit about this because it's a good context for the conversation that we're going to have this evening about climate leadership. So she serves as an officer within the governor's cabinet and is principal policy advisor to and primary representative of the governor on all matters relating to climate. She is tasked with leading the development and implementation of policy within executive department agencies and offices in all matters relating to or affecting climate innovation, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And this includes some of the following specific things. Establish a network of state, regional, and local partnerships to ensure that all communities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have the opportunity to be heard on energy and climate decisions that affect them, and a pathway to request the support that they need to build climate resilience in ways that address community priorities. Convene and engage all cabinet secretaries and relevant agency and authority heads in the design, development, and funding of integrated climate policies. Go after and administer federal funds alone or in consultation and coordination with other executive offices, and recommend to the governor methods and means to prioritize the allocation of state funds in ways that will meet the Commonwealth's goals. This is a big brief, and there also was another detail in there, which was that within the first 180 days of her leadership of this office, there was a report to be prepared. And so we'll hear a little bit more about where the team is with developing that report as we look at a June deadline. I'm very excited to think tonight with all of you about what other states can learn from Massachusetts' example. It's an exemplar, and we should all be so lucky as to have a chief climate officer. A little bit more about Chief Hoffer. She previously joined the Biden administration as a day one political appointee in 2021, serving as the acting general counsel and principal deputy general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. She led the EPA's Office of General Counsel through the transition until November 2021 and continued to serve as Principal Deputy General Counsel. Prior to that, she worked in the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office as Chief of the Environmental Protection Division, beginning in 2012, and was named Chief of then Attorney General, now Governor Maura Healey's newly formed Energy and Environment Bureau in 2015, where she oversaw the work of the Bureau's attorneys on matters including prosecuting civil and criminal enforcement of environmental laws. And one of those cases was leading the office's litigation against ExxonMobil for deceiving Massachusetts investors. Yep, I think that's worthy of applause. Deceiving Massachusetts investors and consumers about the risk climate change poses to Exxon's business and global financial markets and the impacts of its fossil fuel products on climate change. Prior to that, service in the AG's office, Hoffer held senior roles at the Conservation Law Foundation and practiced for many years as a litigator and environmental lawyer at WilmerHale. She also served as a law clerk for the Honorable Magistrate Judge Joyce London Alexander of Boston's Federal District Court, and the credentials: a JD from Northeastern University School of Law, a certificate in environmental management from Tufts, an MED from the University of Massachusetts, and a bachelor's from Hampshire College. And as if all of that were not just overwhelming and amazing enough, we get to my team's favorite part of this bio, which is that in her spare time, Climate Chief Hoffer raises a small herd of Nigerian dwarf dairy goats at her farm in Barre, Massachusetts. So very well-rounded and amazing. And please join me on the stage for a conversation. And please welcome Climate Chief Hoffer. Can we get the, now that's working, right?
Yeah. Better?
Yeah, good. All right, great. So folks, we have structured this evening as a conversation to start with, and I've got some question prompts to share with Chief Hoffer, and then we want to open it up to all of you, so you can be thinking about what questions, what comments you would like to share. But I want to start with this one. So I love this title that you have, Climate Chief. I think that's incredible and powerful and truly exemplary. And as that principal policy advisor to and representative of the governor on everything relating to climate, you have a really big brief. Really, really big and really urgent and really important. And so I wanted to ask you, because our theme is focused on climate migration and specifically on centering equity in that process, how did those dimensions of climate resilience work factor into what you're doing with your team?
Thanks. And thanks to you for having me here tonight and to Antioch and all of your sponsors. I'm just going to give a shout out to some old friends who I was happy to see. Bob King, longtime member of the New Hampshire CLF board, and John Bolduc and Susie Mosier. And all these are folks who over the years have influenced my own thinking at various stages in my career. So Massachusetts did a 2022 climate assessment, and it found that we really need to get ready. We have not done a very good job yet of preparing for migration, whether that's in-migration from other parts of the country or for migrants fleeing climate and related economic harms in other countries. So it's a key priority for us now. There are multiple studies, and I think probably folks in this room are familiar with them, that suggest that New England and Massachusetts could be receiving areas. It will probably be a little cooler, a little wetter, probably have a bit more water and food security. So we're expecting that we're going to be an area where we will be receiving folks from other parts of the country, maybe folks from the Southwest fleeing drought, from folks in the West Coast who are dealing with fires, and in the South where it's too difficult to grow traditional crops. Maybe some of that will move north. So the impacts of that can really range. You know, we're expecting that our communities are going to need to think about the impacts on schools and on services and utilities. What is the change that happens when folks come to a community and there are different cultures present that perhaps haven't been there before? How do we get ready for all of that? So we've had some previews. We've had a couple things occurring now and then in the recent history that have given us some glimpses of what the future might hold. You all might be following, but we right now in Boston are just having a crisis around immigration. We have a large number of folks coming from Latin America, from Haiti, fleeing violence in those countries, fleeing economic collapse, and coming in large numbers. And we have been, really pressed to have adequate services to meet the needs of this community. We're putting people up in hotels. We're trying to ensure that they have appropriate health care. When they don't have a place to go, they often will show up at Boston Medical Center at the ER because there's no other place to go. So this is, you can see this is happening in New York City as well. So how we're going to deal with that? I mean, clearly a lesson learned from that, and this is somewhat unpredictable, but having the planning in place so that we understand what to do when something like this happens is very, very important. Other recent examples, after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, we saw a significant number of people fleeing that damage and devastation, which was climate related, coming to Holyoke, Massachusetts, which there is a large Puerto Rican community there now. So that was, yet another kind of preview of the kinds of climate disasters that might drive migration, the types of receiving communities. And, one thing there is it's a very obvious and human thing. Well, why Holyoke? Well, it's because maybe you have some family there, or maybe that's where people know your traditions or speak your language and you're going to have some comfort. So that seems like a good place to go. So thinking about that can help us have a better sense of where people might end up. Another example we had was COVID-19 in the Berkshires, I think in Egremont in particular, saw an influx of folks coming in, fleeing cities during the pandemic. And that town, in response, took advantage of one of our municipal vulnerability preparedness grants to start to put in place, identify what are the climate risks. Migration is one of those. What would they need to do to have an appropriate adaptation pathway in place? So those are some of the lessons, and what do we take from it? We take from it the fact that we need to have good planning, that we need to have appropriate budgeting for these things, that we need to do the work now to understand and get our arms around it. Right now, we don't have very good data on what the rate of in-migration or other migration is, but in our state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, which we fondly call our SHMCAP, we will be undertaking some study of that so we can kind of get our arms around it. But on the environmental justice point, which is a really important point, the whole dynamic of climate-driven migration is a climate justice and environmental justice issue. And you mentioned the Exxon case, and I remember when we were first going through documents that had been released by Inside Climate News, for example, and the LA Times. Exxon had a very good understanding a long time ago, when I was in 4th grade or so, of the impacts of continuing to combust fossil fuels at the level that we were. And one of those was large-scale human migrations. So we've known about this for a while. We've lost some time with a denial campaign and really coming up with a way to handle it. And now we're in the midst of it, and we see it happening around the world. We see some reaction to it, potentially driving some of the movement we see toward authoritarianism, some of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we have in this country. So, when I think about getting ready for it and it being an environmental justice issue, and the fact that many indigenous communities and people of color around the world are going to be disproportionately and are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. The fact that women, I think the UNN has said something like 80% of climate refugees are women. We all know about the planning, we all know about the budgeting, and I think we all have a general sense of the impacts. But one thought exercise I wanted to invite us to do, thinking about this question, is, imagine you are in your hometown, and it's a place that you love, and you have your community there, and maybe that town itself is starting to experience some effects of climate change. Maybe more frequent storm events, or you're experiencing more power outages. Maybe there are cultural traditions associated with your town that are beloved that you're losing. Maybe it snowed a lot there and the recreational skiing's going away, or maybe everybody used to tap their trees in the spring and now there's no more sugaring. So there's already some sense of loss, maybe some instability in your own town. and maybe you're worried about your kids. And it's into that. It's not going to be into our towns now, which are relatively stable, right? But as we go through climate change ourselves and our own towns become more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, it is those conditions that are going to be present when we are receiving climate migration in the future. So I think it's really important for us now to start thinking about our values as communities. What kind of community do we want to be when we are responding to an influx of people who are going to be coming from very desperate situations? What do we want our reactions to be? How will those values affect what our decisions are around adaptation pathways? And I think that's a conversation that we have to start having now so that we're prepared psychologically for these impacts. It's very easy to kind of, at least for me, you know, we can look at the numbers and we prepare for a talk like this and we've got the research that's been presented today. But to really think like, what is that going to feel like? I think that's an important part of what we have to do.
Thank you. That's a great place to get started, right? These are big issues. You've just been talking about all of the different dimensions that, that maybe people are in denial about, that maybe people are a little scared about, maybe other people are sort of champing at the bit to want to tackle. But I imagine coming into your role about 5.5 months ago, not everybody was super excited that the state of Massachusetts was going to have a climate chief. And so I guess I want to start by asking you, what have been the biggest and best surprises since you assumed the role?
Well, that one's easy, and I think the biggest and best surprise for me was there was a pent-up demand for an Office of Climate. And I wasn't sure what to expect because it is layering, you know, you show up with your Gov hat on and it changes the dynamic in a room a little bit. And what I found, to my pleasant surprise, were the number of people who, you know, I'm thinking of our procurement folks. They had like 10 ideas. They were just ready, you know, we've been wanting to do this, and can we talk to you about this? And here are our ideas about, you know, how we might be able to modify our procurement rules and processes so that we are, you know, driving more climate-friendly practices in the vendors that we do business with. And that's just kind of played out across the board. We have a Global Warming Solutions Act in Massachusetts and a Green Communities Act. Those passed back in 2008. They were, at that time, some of the most, you know, innovative pieces of climate legislation in the country. And then it took us a long time to really get in gear with our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, enforceable reduction commitments across the 4 primary sectors, you know, the power sector, transportation, buildings, and natural and working lands. So, you know, one of the reasons we did this office is because it can't just be owned by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs or the Department of Environmental Protection. It's bigger than that, as we were just saying. It's Health and Human Services, it's transportation, it's the folks who respond to emergencies, it's you know, our folks in A&F. Like one of the first exercises I did, you can imagine the delight of all the people when this started to occur. But, you know, when we were going through our capital planning process for each of the agencies, I showed up for every single one of those. And, you know, if we were talking about, okay, we're planning on buying a vehicle, you know, I was the one who would ask the question, okay, well, is that an electric vehicle? And if it's not, why? And when is it going to be an electric vehicle? Because we're phasing out ICEs by 2035. And if we're going to build something, okay, is it going to be an electrified building? If we're buying a lawnmower, great, is it an electric lawnmower? So, you know, those are the kinds of things that we've been doing, and people have been really excited to engage the issues. So that's been the pleasant surprise.
What about the flip side of that? What have been the biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenge is, I'm curious if anyone else in this room is experiencing it. I mean, this moment is quite different, right? Like, we've been pushing for a long time, working for climate change. You know, many of us might have come up through different organizations where we were pretty siloed in thinking about it, like you're the transportation climate person. I mean, literally, Conservation Law Foundation, like EPA, it's set up into the Office of Air and Radiation. Or, you know, like the climate office, and you've got the water office, and like never the twain shall meet. So right now, I think in part because of the Biden administration's policy, the funding is driving desiloing, so that's a big piece of it. But now I think everybody's starting to understand, like, oh, oh, I can't really decarbonize buildings unless we're also getting the grid decarbonized at the same time, so I kind of have to understand what's happening with that. And, by the way, if I'm doing that, I have to do a little bit of something with buildings and transportation, because I have to make sure that I can charge my electric vehicle at this electrified building. Like, suddenly I think everybody's starting to see the synthesis of it. And there's a lot of learning to be done there. And there's also just a lot of people don't know each other. They haven't worked across these, they don't have those trusting relationships yet. And someone told me, a friend of mine, a couple weeks ago, and I think this is my new mantra, government proceeds at the pace of trust. And that's really true. So part of what we're trying to do with this, which is less producing report in June, it's building that connective tissue between the staff that work at these different agencies. We just had our first retreat. We had some speakers come in, we had some food, just to get to know each other a little bit and start to build trust so they can understand each other's areas of expertise, pick up the phone, but also know each other as humans, because this work is exceptionally hard. You all know, sitting with data like this every day is not a picnic. So building that support for them and helping them get that in place so that we can de-silo with grace is a challenge. Yeah.
I like that expression, silo with grace. And what you're describing is a key point that came out of today's research meeting, that idea of getting out of our silos, of building that connective tissue, of creating networks that enable people to build capacity together. And as you say, proceeding at the pace of trust, right? And so I guess maybe you partially answered this question already, but I'm curious to know, what is enabling you and your team to be effective? Like, what are the conditions that are allowing you to make progress?
It's just such a stubborn, gritty little group of people. Like, there are literally 3 of us. And we didn't really have deep prior working relationships before, and are just incredibly passionately committed to dealing with climate change. And I think that's what we all kind of keep coming back to. We all have very different work styles, which is a good balance. But I would say that commitment is really important. And I should say, the executive order that you mentioned earlier establishes a pretty innovative administrative framework, because of course we couldn't do all this with 3 people. But it creates Secretariat climate officers in each of the cabinet secretariats. So there's a person now in every agency that is owning climate change. And it's that person's job to develop a plan, which for their own secretary's approval, that lays out what their responsibilities are. Some of those are legislatively mandated, some of those are flowing from our policy mandates. So that's really helping a lot too. And as I mentioned, people have kind of come out of the woodwork. They want to help with things. And so there's a team that's helping us who are, somewhat self-selected and really, really, they get it and they're really passionate about working. So I think that's our secret sauce.
Great. Okay, so all of that being said, what do you need more of? Like, what do you wish you had? If you could wave a magic wand, what are the things that would really enable you and the team and all of these folks who hold those portfolio responsibilities to make progress more quickly?
There are 3 things. And the first thing is, I really want people to start having very candid conversations with each other about what we're facing. There is much more of that happening now than when I started working on these issues 20 or so years ago. But the more people who run businesses and institutions and foundations and nonprofits, the more those folks who really wield power in our culture, who will be willing to say these things to me quietly after an event, but not quite yet out loud, the more that we can do that, the more it puts winds in the sails of a governor like Governor Healy, who is willing to go out there and do something like this because she understands how important climate change is for everything else that we care about. So that would be one. Got to start having those conversations. And of course, the other are money and people to do the work. So the cost of decarbonization is huge. People don't like to say that, but it is. And of course, that's a bargain compared to the cost of not doing anything about climate change. So even though it has a high cost, it's also really, really worth doing because it's much cheaper than not doing anything, both in terms of, cost to our markets, our financial markets, our global financial markets, and the humanitarian costs. So we do need innovation in financing, and I think you see a lot of that happening now through the Inflation Reduction Act, incredible combination of tax credits coming through the IRA, money coming from DOT, money coming through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund soon from EPA. That's $27 billion to set up, effectively some type of green banking structure that will allow us to de-risk transactions like decarbonizing low income and affordable housing so that we can bring private capital to the table. We can bring impact investors to the table. We can maybe bring philanthropy to the table with that and get that work done. So it's enormously expensive. We need a lot of money for it, and we need different ways to think about how we finance some of this stuff. And the second thing is, at least in Massachusetts, we are about 30 to 40,000 workers short for what we need for our clean energy economy. Mass CEC runs these numbers for us. We have a skills cabinet that's comprised of Secretary Tutwiler, our education secretary, Secretary Jones, who is our labor secretary, Secretary Tepper, and Secretary Howe, who's over economic development. And they are putting together plans so that we can have the education for people who are in our clean energy economy and also the jobs. And this is really everything from people installing solar panels to we have a chronic shortage of electricians, HVAC people who can install electric heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, people who know how to design, there's a shortage of people for everything for offshore wind right now, in part because of the war in Ukraine has caused a little bit of a gold rush for wind development in Europe, which has sucked some of the talent that we would normally rely on here, along with the stuff to build it and the ships that it takes. So we really need people at all levels. And when I'm talking to young people and students, it's like driving the T is a climate job. Understanding, driving an electric bus is a climate job. Planning nature-based resilient strategies for our coasts, that's a climate job. Understanding what we're going to do, with our landfill waste so that we can, perhaps tap those methane emissions to power energy needs, that's a climate job. So there are so many climate jobs out there, and helping people get the education that they need and then teeing them up in the time frame that we need, because we all know from the IPCC's AR6 synthesis report in March, we've got just about 6.5 years now, so tick-tock. We have to get this stuff moving.
And that's a good segue to what other states ought to be learning right now from the Commonwealth's experience. We have people in the audience tonight, I'm sure, from New York State, from Maine, from Vermont, from New Hampshire certainly, and probably some other states I haven't named yet. So what can the rest of these states be learning?
Well, I would say we all learn from each other, and certainly, having worked here in New Hampshire, I know people are thinking about this, and there are different ways to do it. This is a very formalized structure for doing it, and Massachusetts has, a huge state government infrastructure, and so this kind of makes sense for us. I think there are maybe other ways, but I think the most important thing is, whether you do it by legislation creating office or we did it by executive order, making sure, the governor, at least at the state level, and I think a lot of the action is in the states right now. We're not going to get much federal legislation in this particular moment. We're really, really lucky we got the funding that we got. So a lot of action at the state level. It's crucial for states right now and local governments. So just making sure that everybody who is leading for that governor in the agencies understands that they need to own this in some ways and that they are coordinating with each other. And the first things that I did, we meet every week as a cabinet, and I established a climate cabinet, and we meet every month. And we do a range of things. Some of it's housekeeping, like we're getting up to date on what's happening with the reports, and the Secretariat climate officers are reporting out on what they're doing. Or we have guest speakers come in, and those folks will talk about, different topics that are interesting in terms of, substantive expertise within the cabinet. We've got somebody scheduled in to come in and talk to us about climate finance and impacts of climate change on economy and real estate soon. So, It's a way for us to educate each other, for us to learn from each other about what we're seeing, build those relationships, and understand like this is a priority for the governor. What are we all doing on it together? Because we all have an obligation to ensure that we are doing our part. So however you can set that up in the state, I think is the answer. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all in terms of the structure, and part of that depends on the culture of the particular state.
Great. So you've just mentioned working with municipal folks, county level folks, and that's been the focus for our climate center at Antioch for 10 years. And the reason for that was numerous, but one, because the research shows that that's where you can get a lot of traction, where it really matters in terms of addressing impacts immediately, because people feel the impacts so keenly at that scale. But the reality too is that it's a lot less ideological, right, at that scale. Like when your annual budget for salting your roads, sanding your roads goes out because you've had several major storms in a row, where you've had an ice storm that's knocked out power to your communities for weeks on end, nobody really cares whether climate change is real or not. Like, I think we're past that debate in many ways, but back 10 years ago, we were still very much in the depths of a debate about whether climate change is a thing. At the municipal scale, the local government scale, that didn't really matter so much. It was really just about getting the job done and helping people in the community, helping residents. And so I'm curious about how you at a state level are really tapping into work with county and municipal folks to move the overall agenda forward.
So in Massachusetts, it's more on a city and town basis. We don't really have the county structure. So we do have counties, but that's the local governments with which we interact are the 351 cities and towns through the state. And there's a lot of range. Some of our cities and towns have very sophisticated climate plans. They're a part of our Green Communities law. They understand, how to go after the money that's available to do various decarbonization projects and resilience projects. And then there are some that, it's very, very hard. Like in your example, maybe some of our smaller rural communities, and they're interested. It's not for lack of interest, but the budgets are so tight, and they don't really have the staff available. So one of the things that we've been focused on is figuring out what to do for those communities. And, we have a lieutenant governor who is, led Salem for many, many years and is just, really great on these issues, and I've consulted with her. And there are a couple different models that we can use in terms of sort of creating relationships between some of the cities and towns that have kind of understand what to do, and could they partner with some of the others. And the other is, there's not such a difference in some of these categories of cities and towns that we can't think of kind of general templates. Like some of the rural towns, they have a lot in common. If you're a rural town or city, below a certain population, here's what you'd kind of like to do. We probably don't need to have like an individual person or individual consultant or employee developing something for each one of those. Maybe we can do more things in a template fashion or as a group. And that's going to be true for some of our coastal communities too. So we're thinking about that. But as a concrete matter, there's so much federal money flowing right now that the federal government recognized that there was actually a need to support with some funding planning grants to the states to kind of understand how to go after all the money and how they can best position themselves to have a coordinated plan, so they're not just sort of randomly going after grant here and here, but you've got a comprehensive plan in place and you're being very thoughtful about it. So that's called the Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant, and it's a formula grant. Everyone will get one, except for the states that don't. But we definitely want ours. And we just submitted our application for it. And when it comes, we'll be setting up a very specific stakeholder group that's focused on this exactly. What can we be doing? Because as you mentioned at the outset, part of my remit is to make sure that we've got a network in place that helps municipalities in particular and gives them more choice in the energy future for their community. So connected to that too, I just wanted to briefly mention, Secretary Tepper announced, I think about 2 weeks ago now, that Massachusetts will be establishing a siting commission. I don't know what your experience has been here, but we're starting to see a bit of a backlash against utility scale solar installations in the central and western part of the state. And that is in part because of conflicts over forest use. And there have been some unfortunate examples where these installations went up in a fashion that later caused pretty, stormwater impacts and things that we wouldn't want to see. And maybe you caught this article in the Post over the weekend too, but there was a great piece just kind of giving you a visual on all the land use that would be needed in the country if we did all the renewables build out that we need. So there's a lot of kind of land use conflict arising around renewables, and which does two things. One, it should make all of us pivot back to what else can we do on the demand side, and we should be looking at things like virtual power plants, which LPO I think is going to be funding soon. But it also makes us realize that we need a much more rational process around siting. And we do have an energy facility siting board in Massachusetts, but it hasn't got a very good history of really taking community impact and really taking environmental justice considerations into effect. You have probably seen some of the particular projects in the news, so I'm not going to go into them. But we've got to get a lot better at that. And communities need to feel like they really have a voice in what's happening. At the same time, I think we probably need more of a shared vision about where we're going to build out all the stuff that we need, because this energy transition is going to require a lot of new infrastructure. We're going to need, more distribution system infrastructure. We're going to need more transmission lines. We're going to need more substations. We're going to need battery installations. So that how are we going to figure out where that stuff goes and what is the process and how do we get people comfortable and on board with it. So I think that is crucial. And of course, municipalities play a huge role in that and need to help us figure it out.
It makes me, the questions about siting and how much land is going to be required for that makes me think about an incredible resource that we found years ago. We actually invited the lead of that research team to our 2016 convening in Baltimore. And that's the research coming out of Stanford University that's behind the infographics produced by the Solutions Project, right? Which shows at a state-by-state scale, here's the entire mix you need for 100% conversion to wind, water, and solar by the year 2050. Commercial rooftop solar, residential rooftop solar, offshore wind, onshore wind. And it was really brilliant because in a single page, it covered all of the necessities in terms of land usage and what the mix of the portfolio would look like and what the benefits would be in terms of the reduction in cost per kilowatt hour, what the reduction would be in public health impacts, whether it's asthma or other kinds of public health problems related to combustion of fossil fuels. And I still to this day just am so grateful to them for not only doing this really in-depth modeling and research, but then translating it into a very accessible platform that makes it easy for anybody to literally download a page about their state and be able to see, okay, this is doable, this is achievable, we can do this. It's really a question of leadership, right? It's not a question of can we do it. It's a question of how quickly and who's gonna help us get there.
Yeah, that is completely true. Absolutely. Yeah.
So so I want to open it up to this group. You all have been listening very patiently and wonderfully, and we've got some microphones. We've got some folks who are going to take those mics out into the audience, and this is an opportunity. If you have a question, if you have a comment that you would like to share at this point, now is the opportunity.
Thank you. I love the climate cabinet. I want to take it back to Maine. I have a question about whether you've had a conversation with, if you have a Department of Labor in Massachusetts, whether there's been any conversations around linking the immigrants that are being housed in hotels and training that workforce, temporary work visas, any conversation with the power of a municipality the size of Boston to change federal law to allow these people to work. Because we need those workers, and we need them a whole lot sooner than immigration law may change. And whether that's been any part of your conversation.
It's a great question, and I actually don't know the answer to that question. I will say we've certainly been thinking about the fact that it's, it's a wonderful fit, and I know I'm pretty sure that I'm remembering the place right, but I know that I'm pretty sure it's Minneapolis, Minnesota, has been working with their immigrant community there, in particular, to get people trained for jobs working in their transit system. So it seems like an incredible opportunity for us if we can make it work. These are people who really want to work.
Thank you so much for your leadership. And I'm so glad that you are so smart, just to be blunt. I'm really grateful. Being from Massachusetts, I'm grateful for your leadership. I think of countries that are tackling climate effectively, and it's the social democracies and the dictatorships, like Singapore, because they have that centralized vision and regulation and funding, and we have kind of, at best a liberal libertarian system that is very difficult to have collective action, even, especially during this time of kind of anti-government vibe, especially in DC. Are you thinking about what a Massachusetts/New England model of that kind of collective government action could look like? Could you bridge that gap between state and municipal and have some kind of regional support? How can we get closer to what Scandinavia and Germany can do?
Also another great question. I mean, in part, I think these carbon pollution reduction grants that I mentioned, a couple of them are going out to aggregates of municipalities. So there's in fact, the one that MAPC is going to be coordinating, I think it has 188 cities and towns in Massachusetts and some in New Hampshire. And then there's another Central Mass one that will run through the Central Mass Planning Agency, and then there's one in Southeastern Mass and part of Rhode Island. So, that will be somewhat coordinated with what we're doing with our planning, because we work with all those folks. But, the thing that popped into my mind when you first asked this question isn't entirely on point, but I don't know if you guys remember Brian Donahue, but this was going back, Bob King might remember this. This is many years ago, maybe like 2012 or in around there. There was a project that I think UNH had a hand in. It was how would New England feed itself? Could we get 60% of our food grown here? And it was an incredibly good piece of work product. And there were, involvement of all the New England states. I don't know where this landed, but I remember staying on top of the research at time, and I know it had foundation funding. And it was a lot of food. There was places where we could be growing grain, and obviously there's dairying and expansion of, vegetable and fruit production. I also remember at the time I was at CLF, so this is going back many years now, talking to the agricultural representatives in each of the New England states, because there's all that conversation is always happening among the departments of environmental protection, departments of agriculture. There's a lot of kind of informal collaboration that happens. And those folks were already talking about water management in anticipation of in-migration. So, this is 11 years ago. And so I think those models are places, maybe less formal than what you were contemplating with your question. But I think those are the spaces where we can start doing some of that collaboration, because we have to. Like, obviously, we do it on transmission. Enough said about transmission. But there are other places where I think we can be more intentional about it. And this topic this evening is probably one of them, because we're not going to just have migration to Massachusetts. We'll have it to New England. Massachusetts might be, there might be, because of availability of housing or support services or whatever, maybe it'll be, particularly preferable for some communities. But I think we can expect that throughout New England. And I think we do need to start planning now for how we can rely more on our bioregion, if you will, for food production. How are we going to manage the water resources? What are we going to do with the wood basket? I'm very mindful of that, because especially as we are losing our western forests, that kind of changes the national picture in terms of what we're going to do for sequestration. So I think those types of coordinated efforts that are perhaps less formal now among the New England states is a good place to get started.
Hi there. Thanks so much for this wonderful talk tonight, especially from a fellow Melissa. I want to go back to, you were talking about the federal landscape and money flowing right now through the IRA and the infrastructure bill and so on. A major concern that I have from a climate adaptation planning perspective is that that money is still mostly coming post-disaster, like through the Stafford Act. So how are you, at the state level and then supporting capacity building at the municipal level, how are you getting around that? How are you trying to do sort of pre-disaster planning?
Well, part of what we have is this thing called the SHIM cap. So it's the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. So the Hazard Mitigation Plan is the thing that we have to do for Stafford Act eligibility. And then the Climate Adaptation Plan part of it, I think is novel. I don't know if other states are doing this, but it was our effort to link what you're talking about with our hazard planning. So we identify climate risks or vulnerabilities from a resilience standpoint, and then we put in that plan what we're going to do about it. So for what we were talking about this evening, this assessment, getting our arms around the data first is one thing. So that's one thing that we're trying to do, but your overall point is a really good one. And, you know, as I mentioned at the outset, because we lost 40 years due in part to this denial campaign, we are now in the unenviable position of having to do very steep emissions reductions at the same time that we're getting hit by more severe climate impacts. So this is something that I think probably everybody has in their mind, but it really bears worth repeating. That is very hard. It's not like we have lots of time, you know? I mean, let's just take Boston, for example. I think the cost of resilience measures for the city of Boston have been estimated around $3 billion. So that's a lot of money. It's cheaper than what it costs for us to clean up the harbor and build Nut Island, which is about $4.7 billion. But it's still a lot of money. And you know, we need to get that started because in the high emissions scenario for sea level rise in Boston is 6 feet. So, you know, we know that's you know, we're gonna look at maybe something like even 3 feet. You know, I could show you the map of like what the water covers at that stage. So we have some time for that. But then when I think about what happens if a Hurricane Sandy comes right now to Boston, I don't think we're well positioned. So we are thinking very carefully about, are the existing governance structures that we have sufficient for us to take on a coastal resilience project like that? So that gives you a sense of some of the questions that you'll see, I think, when this June report comes out. Because, you know, while we are looking at the policies that the agencies have right now and, you know, what's working, what we can lift up, there's certainly gaps that we're all identifying. And I think this is one. We've, you know, for probably some of the people in the room remember this, right? There was a time when like talking about adaptation was verboten. You know, it was all about mitigation. We're not going to talk about adaptation. We got to get the emissions down, and we're all about RGGI, and we're all about Clean Power Plan, and you guys remember all that. And now I think everybody's going, oh, wow, we really have to pivot, and we have to do these at the same time.
Hold on. Is this?
It's okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to second the cabinet back to Maine idea, being from Maine. So yeah, I just really look forward to like creating that kind of a backbone to our structure. It would be excellent. But my question's about your procurement and the emissions and with stuff, because we've been looking at an alternative emissions analysis in Maine called a consumptions-based emissions inventory. Instead of just looking at our emissions just from the state of Maine, we would look at them from a life cycle emissions and from all the things we consume from elsewhere. And there's some really interesting research that basically shows that, you know, China's not actually a huge emitter when you look at our stuff, because Europe, you know, the European countries and the U.S. wind up being much larger emitters when we consider, you know, the emissions embedded all the products and stuff we buy. So we're pretty excited for the results to come out, and I think it's going to really inform what we do from procurement. And so I'm just intrigued about your conversations and what we might learn in Maine about how we can, you know, buy greener products and reduce our emissions from our stuff. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, kudos to Maine. you guys are just knocking it out of the park with building electrification. I think, we were just scratching our heads, and I think we explain it by the fact that you just sort of bypassed the whole rely on natural gas phase, which put you, I think, in a better position to just go from home heating fuels to home heating oil to electric air source heat pumps. So we have a lot to learn from you in that regard. On this notion, the current social cost of carbon is $51 per ton. When the Biden administration released the draft methane regulations for existing oil and gas sources, there was in that docket as well an EPA proposed update to the social cost of carbon that would peg it at $190 a ton. So you and I know that makes a really big decision. Suddenly, difference. Suddenly, policy choices that may have looked cost prohibitive in the past, when you begin to internalize the cost of climate change, suddenly look like a very good idea. And so, this is, I always tell people, has everybody read the Lorax? Yeah, so it's like the best textbook on environmental externalities ever. So, thinking about the power of a social cost of carbon is certainly something that we're looking at. And in the procurement context, in our conversations with what the federal government is doing, we've spoken to folks at Commerce, and obviously we signed into Buy Clean. I don't know if I think you guys did that too. But what they're doing right now, I think, to kind of socialize some of these ideas is the very first thing they're asking for their large vendors is disclose your carbon emissions consistent with what the Carbon Disclosure Project would require. And then next, tell us what your plan is for reducing that consistent with STBI. And then lastly, disclose to us what you think your financial risk is. And that would be consistent with the Task Force on Financial Disclosures. And I think that is akin to what the SEC has proposed for publicly traded companies to disclose their climate risk. And that climate risk can be a couple different things. It might be the risk to your own company caused by physical impacts of climate change. So you make candy bars and it's going to be hard for you to get sugar or cocoa because of climate change because it's not growing where it used to, or it's harder to transport it. And it can be things like people shifting away from your products. And this is where, ESG has been so demonized because of its potential to actually shift investment away from fossil fuels. So those are the things we're contemplating right now. And I don't think at this point, it would be dispositive. Like we're going to go with you or not based on that. But we do want people to start paying attention to that and to know that at some point we are going to start making decisions based on what your emissions are and how good of a job you're doing tracking them and trying to reduce them.
Is this all good? It is on. Yes. So I've been reading Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is really more about why to blow up a pipeline. And he's from Sweden. He would look at the US and say, well, we're decarbonizing some things, but we're also producing more oil and gas than ever before. And we're following a kind of Norwegian or even maybe Saudi model right now of getting our own house in order and making our own numbers look good, but being the start of the supply chain that threatens the conditions for life on planet Earth. So, and young people are reading this book and other books and engaging in die-ins in Boston and blocking coal trains in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. These are people who've given up on the policy and the agencies that you talk about and are doing civil disobedience and direct action in order to shut down the fossil fuel supply. So what do you tell people like that? How do you persuade them to believe in government, basically?
I wonder if it's possible. I wonder if that project is possible. First of all, don't blow up a pipeline. I think there's enormous value in nonviolent protest. People need to make their voices known. They need to make their fears and their anger known. I think anger can really power very positive social movements. We've seen that in this country many times. So that is really critically important. But I also feel like looking back at, what really made the difference. You've got a combination of things. You've got large-scale social movements that start to make inroads into a political process. And right now, the analogy that I have in my mind is civil rights. And it is together that those things make a sea change in how governance works and in what rights are available to people. And that comes as a result of both civil disobedience and nonviolent civil disobedience, emphatically nonviolent civil disobedience, and organization across many sectors, boycotts that businesses were involved in, engagement of faith leaders, working with political leaders, LBJ, Kennedy, right? So I think that is probably more akin to the model of change. And can we convince young people? I don't know. I just started a youth climate council because I feel it is so crucial for those young people to be at the table when we are making decisions about what will affect their lives. It is very difficult to look at young people sometimes knowing what we know in this room, right? And they know it. We all know what's happening. And so I think it's very important. I would like to get them into a scenario where they can come to a legislative hearing, where they can go to a hearing at the DPU, where they can hear a conversation in the governor's office, and they can understand, like, these are the considerations, and when the decision makers are making a decision, they are looking at the folks who are going to live with that decision. I think that's really important. I think it's really important for a second reason, which is I want them to understand how government works. I want them to understand what the levers of power are within a government, how a democracy works, how it makes change, how it's based on data and facts and not opinions that a dominant group shares. That's the model. It doesn't always happen that way, but I do want them to understand that so that they can be empowered throughout their own lives to create better laws. I think we're going to see that. We're already seeing some of that. So you're asking a really important question, and people are going to resort to many different kinds of actions in the coming years, and you can see the retaliation in terms of the criminalization for even things like nonviolent civil disobedience, that this is going to become quite difficult soon. I think we will see violence over this, and that is why I am so emphatic about we should not be the ones that are starting it. We should refuse to do that because we are better than that. And I personally believe that we can make a change. It doesn't all have to come through government. There are incredible leadership that's happening in the business community now as well. You see it at every level. So I feel like we really have these important values about who we are as a people to hold up in this process. And I'm thinking of, I don't know if anybody knows Joanna Macy, but I heard her speak, gosh, this was maybe a year or so ago. And someone asked her, why do you do all this? Like, how, it's not really going to make any change. Why are you doing all this? And her response to it was, because when things get difficult, I want to have practiced this so I don't respond in a way that's going to exacerbate violence. It was words to that effect. And it gives me chills just to say it now, because that's our humanity. And that's what we're going to have to really hold on to through this.
For probably
Okay, I just, thank you. I'm actually from a Massachusetts community, and I want to thank you. I'm up in the balcony, up here, sorry. Sorry. So I've been working as a municipal official for 23 years, and I've specifically been working on climate change. And I will say that from the beginning, it was certainly very difficult to get anyone to pay attention. And now I feel like we're at a point where it's almost the opposite. I'm not doing everything fast enough. I'm not doing it well enough. It's just, it's a lot of pressure, which is, it's kind of welcome on one hand and exhausting on another. But I think more to what I'm concerned about more recently is having listened to an interview on NPR with the author of Cobalt Red. And the book is about the mining in the Congo and how all of that technology is needed for batteries, also for all of the electronics that we use, specifically our cell phones, our computers. But for me, the reference to the need for it for battery storage. And working in Massachusetts and sort of being at a place where we are pushing the technology for battery storage, for heat pump technology to move away from fossil fuels, I just had sort of a light bulb moment that felt really troubling to feel that there's a part of the world that is not as visible to us, where people are literally dying and suffering, for us to sort of install this technology. And we're doing it now and we're pushing it as this whole scale, almost, is this magic pill that might help us get away from fossil fuel use. And I look at it twofold problem. One is that I don't feel like there's recognition of what's happening. And two, I see it as the future challenge of what happens with all this technology at its end of life. And we're doing it so whole scale that is this a future issue that our children that we're bringing into this conversation about how to deal with this issue, are we then giving them, their future problem to address? So as someone very committed to addressing climate change, I'm really, really struggling with this because publicly, I need to be promoting this technology. Internally, it is really a struggle for me right now to feel that I can morally do this in a way that feels okay. So how are we, if we're really looking at this honestly, how are we to address this? And is the state looking at this?
Thank you so much for that. And I think you've just articulated so well, what I imagine many people feel. Certainly these are some concerns that I have often thought about as well. And one way that I think about it, just speaking personally, is, so climate is part of right? How do you see climate change? Like, what do just think about it for yourself. Like, is climate change the problem? Is it a symptom of a problem? And if it's a symptom, what's the problem? Is climate change the cure? Is it the cure because it's showing us or maybe revealing to us some problems that we have with other systems, right? So how you think about climate change, I think dictates in a lot of ways what sort of the answer is to the conundrum that you're talking about. Because I think some people would say, well, climate change is resulting because it's like an absolutely predictable outcome of an extractive, economic system, right? We exploit lots of things. Think about, for example, I don't recall this question, which is a very important question, coming up as much, when I've talked about, or when people, talk about the problems with fossil fuels. Like, fossil fuels have an incredibly negative impact on the communities and the areas in which they're developed. The whole process, locating the fossil fuels, producing the fossil fuels, transporting them, go down south here to some of these refineries and see how these folks are living. Like, it's a huge, huge problem with our current energy system. So people are rightly pointing out, we don't necessarily want to repeat the same problem, of energy injustice that we did in the past with our new system. And this stuff is going to come up with CCS too. Like, look at the places in the country that are most suitable for CCS. Well, wouldn't you know, it's areas down in Louisiana and other places that already are home to lots of infrastructure that they may or may not have wanted to be there in the first place. So I think it's the right question to be asking, and we do need to be using those rare minerals. So are there ways that we can do it differently? Are there ways that we can do it differently this time in terms of, the worker protections that are in place, in terms of how we use these materials here and recycle them? So, one interesting example in Massachusetts with our Clean Energy Center, which is an incubator for entrepreneurial activities, there was a business that came in wanting to, they had technology for recycling the minerals in EV batteries. So what Mass CEC will do is provide, subsidy to an entrepreneur like that to kind of get them through their early stages of funding. And they, kind of got them through the pandemic, and they got their first round of funding or whatever happens. I'm not a VC person. And they're doing it. Unfortunately, they're doing it, I think, in Kentucky. So that's not great because we didn't end up getting to retain that business that we helped establish itself. And I think it went there because it's co-located close to car manufacturing and vehicle manufacturing industries. So, I think we can do it differently, and it's a very important question to ask, but it's, kind of a function of these economic systems, right? And it's not just capitalist systems. You see these types of extractive and exploitative impacts occurring in, communist systems and socialist systems as well. So the way I think about these things generally is we made choices, we can make different choices, and if we do a good job now of injecting those kinds of values into this debate, as you are with your question, and as I know others in the room are, and I think we're trying to do, maybe we can shape that outcome differently. The practical matter is, for some of these technologies, we do need to use those materials. So I think the question becomes, how can we do that in a way that is safer and humane for those folks? And I also think about the fact that some of these mining industries, for example, people do rely on those jobs. And those are important areas of income for those communities. So, that's yet another sort of dynamic that's involved when we consider, a conundrum like this one. And again, I will just say one more time, the pivot to demand-side management is presented in your question too, right? Can we use less energy? How can we extract the very most from every single watt that we generate? That seems hugely important, not only for the land use impacts that we were talking about earlier, but for some of the humanitarian impacts that you're calling our attention to with your question.
Okay. We are just about at the end of our time together, but I want to take, if there's one more question, we've got time for one more. You've got a mic.
I've got a mic.
Go right ahead.
Great. Well, thanks, Melissa, for being here and sharing your experiences and work in Massachusetts. Have a specific question, but I can broaden it a bit, knowing it's the last one. I want to help round it out. A question around adaptation funding, I think similar to one that was asked previously around, a lot of the funding we see for adaptation and resilience is really post-disaster. I'm from Vermont. We recently submitted for our CPRG. We're excited to get that money very soon, in the next couple of weeks. But are struggling, and particularly thinking about how do we ensure that that huge pot of money, where the guidance from the EPA is primarily focused on greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, how do we use that to expand the conversation and do implementation projects around adaptation and resilience? So I think a specific question around how your team in Massachusetts is maybe using that money to think and work on adaptation and resilience, understanding that the EPA guidance is mostly focused on greenhouse gas mitigation. But I think more broadly thinking about, again, that a lot of the funding we're seeing from the federal government is more focused on that greenhouse gas mitigation. How do we sort of use that to leverage more adaptation and resilience ideas and project implementation? So thank you.
Great question. I'm afraid my response is it's not perhaps particularly apropos for Vermont, but one place where that nexus happens a lot for us is with our public transportation system. So thinking about the resilience of that system, I mean, if you guys know the aquarium and the aquarium T-stop, it's flooded massively 3 times now. That there's a lot of sunny day flooding that's occurring in that part of Boston now. So it's that, but just thinking about where the tracks go in the system, flooding from those events as well. So we're trying to see if we can combine, our focus on making that system more sustainable, expanding it, electrifying it, with some ways to shore up resilience. So I guess a short answer is, where there's a natural fit between resilience and mitigation, like in a project like that, that's how we're trying to work it in.
So thank you so much, Melissa,
Thank you.
for being here
Thanks,
this
everyone.
evening. Thank you all. We're going to let you get back to the Nigerian dwarf boats.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.